Welcome back to Cloud Oasis blog. My name is Hali Aman, and this is part 4 of Veeam Cloud Connect deployment, DR as a Service Cloudcast. One of the challenges that the service provider needs to solve to offer a DR as a service is mimicking the tenant network. As a service provider cannot control the tenant network design, Veeam Cloud Connect provide a unique way to host any customer network design to keep the replica VMs accessible in a case of tenant production side, partial or full failover. On this PowerPoint session, we will discuss Veeam Cloud Connect networking, such as Cloud Connect VLANs, network extension appliances, and public IPs. To make things clear, let's examine the following scenario. A tenant wishes to use Veeam replication to implement a DR strategy. To accomplish this requirement, the tenant contacts a service provider who offers DR as a service based on Veeam Cloud Connect. To onboard the tenant, the service provider needs to create an account for that tenant. Once the account created, Veeam Cloud Connect will deploy a Veeam network extension appliance at the service provider network, on this example with the IP 20. This network extension appliance will be used as a virtual router to create routing between the tenant subnet, the VLAN, on this example VLAN 33, and the service provider network, and also to establish a VPN connection with a tenant site in a case of partial tenant site failover. To keep tenants separated from each other, Veeam will host each tenant within a VLAN. In Veeam Backup and Replication, the service provider can specify VLANs with internet access and VLANs without internet access. VLANs without internet access can be used as internal networks that let VM replicas communicate to each other after full site failover and to production VMs after partial site failover. For VLANs with internet access, Veeam Backup and Replication can also route traffic to the internet through the network adapter, the VNIC, on the network extension appliance that is connected to the service provider network. Once the service provider create and share the tenant account, the tenant will use Veeam console to connect to the service provider DR as a service offering. And once the connection is established, a tenant network extension appliance will be provisioned at the tenant network. By default, the communication port between the tenant and the service provider use a TCP port number 6180. And in a case of DR as a service, the service provider must configure his firewall to open for TCP and UDP traffic on that port. Once the communication is established, the tenant will be able to create a replication job to replicate the VMs to the service provider data center. On this example, the tenant replicates 3 virtual machines, which 2 of these virtual machines are connected to a VLAN without internet access as they share a database or a storage using a private network. But also, note that all the virtual machines are part of a VLAN with internet access. After the replication, the virtual machines are provisioned on a standby state. No one can guarantee that you are immune from any data disaster. But when you are using Veeam Cloud Connect, your remediation from a disaster will be faster than a customer without. Let's discuss 2 examples of a disaster. The first example is a loss of a single workload or a single virtual machine, what Veeam called partial failover. Okay, let's take a look on this scenario. A user is using an application hosted on a virtual machine with an IP address 72. That VM failed and the user lost connection to the application. On this case, the tenant is experiencing a partial workload or site outage and will be able to initiate Veeam Cloud Connect partial failover using Veeam console. The step for the partial failover are as the following. The tenant network extension appliance will start. The tenant network extension appliance at the service provider will start it. The failed VM replica at the service provider side will start. That's the 72. A VPN tunnel will establish between the tenant and the service provider network extension appliances. The user will reconnect to the application through the Veeam network extension appliance at the tenant network. The second type of a disaster is a full site outage. Let's discuss this type of a disaster by providing an example of external users connected to a tenant workload externally. Suddenly, a full site disaster hit the tenant side. All the users connected to the tenant network lost communication with the application or the servers. As the tenant using Veeam Cloud Connect for his DR strategy, all that the tenant need to do once he notified about the disaster is connecting to Veeam Cloud Connect portal using any web-enabled device and initiate a failover plan or full site failover. Full site failover process will start at the service provider side by starting the Veeam network extension appliance and all the virtual machines. Then a public IP address will be published for the external users to use to reconnect to the tenant workload running from the service provider network. With our tenant up and running, time to summarize today's session. On today's session, we discuss the network building blocks of the Veeam Cloud Connect DR as a service solution. We start our discussion with the Veeam Cloud Connect network extension appliances, and as you noticed, it's used as a virtual router to mimic a tenant network at the service provider network. The two types of Veeam Cloud Connect VLANs, VLAN with and without internet access. We discuss the difference between partial and full site failover with an example when and how each type will be implemented and used. And the last topic we briefly mentioned was the public IP addresses which a service provider need to allocate to a tenant if a full site failover is required and external access to a workload is needed. On a future session, I will be demonstrating the configuration of a hardware plan and tenant creation with a hands-on of all the topics we discussed today. As usual, stay tuned and thanks joining me on this Cloudcast.